If you spent any amount of time on YouTube, or just the internet in general at this point really, you've probably come across the content behemoth known as Jubilee, a channel with millions of subscribers and millions more views that creates debate-style content and social experiments that presents itself as building human connection, empathy, and understanding. If they're actually succeeding at those goals, we're going to talk about in just a minute. But recently, as has happened many times before, the platform has come under fire and been the subject of online discourse surrounding their most recent episode, One Conservative vs. 25 LGBTQ Activists, featuring conservative speaker and podcaster Michael Knowles. If you aren't familiar with him, think like Ben Shapiro, Charlie Kirk, like dunking on libs, owning the wokes, like that sort of kind of content. Kind of guys in this like conservative respectability politics, I'm here for civil debate sort of content. And the conversation got spooky to say the least. With talking points such as, let me grab my phone. Talking points such as LGBTQ identity is a social contagion and transgenderism should be eradicated from public life entirely. And understandably so, this spawned a lot of outrage, largely towards Michael, but also some of the people that chose to participate in this debate and questioning why they would even participate at all. And this online discourse has sparked some really interesting conversations about like, what is the purpose of Jubilee? Are they actually trying to have meaningful conversations where people are learning from each other? Or is it just like outrage farming and getting people to fight in the comments for capitalistic gain? What is the purpose of this debate style content, and does it actually have any value in the information age that we're in right now? And also, who should be platformed, and what is the difference between like hosting a debate and platforming someone and allowing them to spread harmful ideologies? We're going to talk about all of this and more in today's episode of Sunday Yap Session, but before we get into it, hi, my name is Jacob. Welcome back to Sunday Yap Session, the show where every Sunday I hop on here and yap at you all about something with some sort of cohesive through line to carry us all through, and sometimes we do better than others. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to give it a like because that helps me out quite a bit. And if you want to come yap with me every single Sunday, be sure to hit that subscribe button because I upload at least once a week, sometimes more. We're still on my polar seltzer kick. This is strawberry watermelon this time. Pretty good, pretty good. So I think a good place to start with this conversation is just talking about like the platform as a whole, why this kind of content is popular right now, because Jubilee is not the only one doing this. You have like The Cut, which I am guilty of watching The Cut. We'll get into kind of my role in consuming this content in a minute, but there are a lot of these channels that are having this sort of like debate style content, social experiments, having people from different groups kind of interact with each other, have conversations, so on and so forth. Jubilee is the one that gets brought up a lot because they have the largest audience by far, and I think that they are the ones that are doing a lot of this more like polarizing sort of content. Not to say that all of their content is like this, I don't want to kind of like brand it all, but we'll get into kind of that nuance in just a minute. But this content seems to be really, really popular these days. And like I said, I watch some of it. I do not watch Jubilee because I think that they are a lot of times insidious. We'll get into why in a minute, but I do watch like The Cut. I love watching like the pop the balloon videos, which those are trash a lot of times too. Like I do like seeing this kind of content where people are interacting with each other, people are having conversations, people are talking about their lived experiences, so on and so forth, ultimately because it's really entertaining, and I think sometimes I do learn things from it as well. But I think foundationally with this Jubilee series in particular, this like 1v25 series that they kind of introduced recently in the grand theme of their content, I have particular issues with, because I think like if we're being honest, it doesn't seem like a lot of this is being done in good faith at all in general, which I think a lot of people watching this are like, yeah, obviously. And I talked about this on TikTok recently, just kind of talking about this whole kind of spectacle about this Michael Knowles situation in general. And I was talking about just kind of like the motivations behind it, so on and so forth. And a lot of people were in the comments just being like, yeah, they're doing it to make money. Obviously, capitalism bad, da 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 da. And I'm like, yes, capitalism bad. But I kind of want to dig deeper. I want to go deeper into this because I think like we can just say, yeah, capitalism bad and like push it aside. But I think there's some really interesting substance here. And I think learning more about who's behind Jubilee made me kind of have these more deeper questions. If you haven't watched Taylor Loren's series Power User, she has a series where she's kind of talking about like online culture and the tech, social media, entertainment space, so on and so forth. And she actually did an interview with the founder of Jubilee and was talking to him about kind of some of the questions that we have related to this conversation. What is the role of like platforming these people? How do you kind of balance between having conversations and teetering into like spreading misinformation? And I thought it was really interesting and really telling some of the questions that he did answer and some of the questions he kind of like skirted around. But I thought it was really interesting that he was a former like worker on the Obama campaign. And not to say that someone couldn't go from being more liberal to more conservative and kind of building this media empire to like subtly push conservative ideologies. But I think what is happening more with this Jubilee stuff is a little bit more insidious and a little bit more ignorant. Or maybe it isn't. I don't know. I could be reading too deep into it. But the kind of opinion and the kind of perspective perspective that I gained after watching this is it seems like this guy is one of these more like free speech absolutists. We need to talk about everything in the kind of public debate. And interestingly, I don't think he really spoke that much to like the editorial perspective of the channel, which to me seems pretty glaringly obvious that there is sort of some kind of lean to a more conservative ideology. Either that or these like conservative talking heads, which to be fair, there are a lot more of them that are on like a big prominent level compared to like more liberal, left-leaning leftist ideologies, largely because a lot of conservatives have money to bankroll these people. But that's a video for another day. But as someone who suffered through the whole Michael Knowles, well, I watched the first hour of it and I had to tap out. I couldn't make it through the whole hour, 40 minutes, but I watched as much of it as I can for y'all. So give me a like just for that first and foremost. But I did kind of scroll through and look at all the videos in this like 1v25 series. And I did notice kind of a skew with the people that they were bringing on. A lot of the more like conservative, right-wing, whatever you want to call it, people that they brought on were like people that have been like in this industry, are like professional talking heads, have a lot of media training. We have Michael Knowles, Ben Shapiro was on there at one point. There were a handful of other ones. And then when they kind of do the inverse and it's a more like left-leaning Democrat, liberal, whatever you want to call it person, it typically is someone who doesn't have as much of this like industry expertise. For example, I think the most popular person that I saw is Destiny, who I believe is like a streamer and content creator. I don't watch Destiny, but I vaguely know who he is. But either way, liberal or conservative, there definitely tends to be a skew in the amount of expertise and media training and kind of skill in a debate versus the other like 20, 25 people that are in their conversation. The rest of them are typically like just everyday average people. Some of them are like social media influencers, YouTubers, but there typically is like a hierarchy imbalance between the people having the debate and the person who's kind of like the lone figure. And I guess like on some level that sort of makes sense because it's like a 1v25. If you're gonna have one person having conversations with 25 people, you probably want to have them be somebody who can kind of speak to a lot of different experiences, so on and so forth. But I think these conversations would be a lot more interesting if there was a lot more balance to the people that are involved in the conversation, and if it was just conversations between like more like everyday people rather than like a talking head media figure versus like 25 normal people. Anyways though, and that kind of gets me into like what is the value of this debate sort of content, specifically in this format, but just like largely in general. I personally am someone who just kind of like dreads this kind of debate style content, which is why I say that I suffered through watching this video, because I really do not like these sort of videos, largely because I think a lot of the people that are going into them are pretty fixed in their views and they aren't really looking for like any sort of actual understanding. I think a lot of that is more like conversational and something that happens over a long period of time through conversation, learning, education, so on and so forth, and isn't something that's going to happen in like a 1.5 hour debate. I don't think that like any Jubilee video, regardless of like how well it's produced, how well it's done, how well it's fact checked, so on and so forth, is actually going to change anybody's worldview in an hour and a half. So just like the premise of it seems kind of ridiculous to me, especially when a lot of the people aren't coming into it with like pre-prepared conversations, because that's an interesting part of these videos as well. Because there was one woman who was in this Jubilee video in particular who was kind of talking about the behind the scenes of it, and she pretty much just knew that she was going to be talking about like LGBTQ conversations.
1, we had no idea who we were going to be debating. 2, we had no idea what his debate topics or debate claims were going to be. Jubilee, however, did. Had I known which conservative was going to be platformed in that video, I'm not sure I ever would have agreed to participate in this filming.
I saw somebody in the actual video themselves say that they weren't allowed to bring notes in. So there isn't really a lot of like preparation, and it really seems like they sit all of these people down, they see who the person they're debating is, and then they kind of just have to like pull from their recollection or whatever, so on and so forth, to kind of make these arguments. And it's very clear that like Michael Knowles was pretty trained for this, and as somebody who's in this space, I imagine he is talking about things that he has kind of media conversations with quite a bit. So it was clear that like he was able to like pull like studies and cite things and so on and so forth that like aided his argument, compared to these like regular people who aren't like debaters that are kind of being thrust into this conversation with this person they didn't even know they were talking to, and maybe would have had an opportunity to like prepare a little bit more to like the certain ideologies that they're peddling. So like I think this like the premise of it is already just kind of like, what's the purpose of this? But like I said, it seemed like the CEO is one of these people who really thinks that like all ideas just need to be talked about in the open, and that, you know, public conversations are how we move forward and that's how we heal the country and so on and so forth. And yes, I think there are some things, many things in fact, that we need to be talking about in kind of like a public square, town square sort of setting. And I guess like the internet is that in a lot of ways. Does it need to be produced by a big media company that's having editorial control over the conversations and who's being brought in and compensating highly media trained speakers? I don't think so, however. But I think this content ultimately does more harm than good, which seems to be something that he doesn't agree with, because even like when Taylor Lorenz was interviewing him, she like basically got him to admit that he knows that people are kind of like clipping these things, and that the way the internet is so siloed right now, like the liberals will take their kind of owns and wins from these videos and spread them around in like left-leaning circles, and the conservatives will do the same sort of thing. So I think with like the way the internet is siloed, like there isn't really a whole lot of like middle ground being found in the first place, although he talks about like how like he'll read the comments and see like, oh my gosh, I have never seen this before. I've never talked to a trans person. I've never talked to a gay person, and this video opened my eyes, blah, 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 blah. I don't think that like that is happening more than like the kind of vitriol and siloed like self-affirmation that kind of happens with these clips. And I guess it's just like a level of personal preference about like, is the level of understanding that could be gained worth the kind of vitriol and like self-confirmation that happens because of these? I would say no, but like I'm also not getting a bag from this, so like, I don't know. But like I said, not even just Jubilee, but this debate style content is kind of all across the internet. And at least to me, I feel like largely it doesn't have a ton of value, largely because of the way they're presented and the way that they're kind of treated like reality TV, like fight sort of content, where you're just waiting for somebody to say like something outrageous or something upsetting and they start yelling at each other. I think this really is treated more like UFC fighting than any sort of like conversations. I think there was like one, I believe Vox did like a series that was kind of like a debate style content. And that's probably like the best kind of attempt I've seen at something like this. All of the questions were kind of like pre-discussed beforehand. They came with like prepared research, and it was like people that were like equal levels of like knowledge and like prominence in these conversations, which like I said before, I think is like should be the prerequisite for a lot of this stuff. But I think ultimately a lot of this debate style content I see just like doesn't feel super valuable. I think a lot of the people that are like producing this are not doing it ethically or responsibly or in a way that like actually benefits anybody else. Especially the y'all that are doing this on the TikTok lives. The TikTok lives are sometimes worse. I feel those get wild. But I think my biggest issue with all of this is that a lot of these debate style content, a lot of the people that produce them, a lot of the people that engage with them, like I said about the CEO, seem to be kind of more in this like free speech absolutist, like all conversations should be had in the square of public debate and everything should be talked about and no one should be like silent, no one should be deplatformed, we should be able to talk about anything and everything. And I'm not saying that like I'm against free speech or things like that, but when it comes to like fascist ideology, talking about certain people groups as like contagion that needs to be eradicated. How much of this is debate and having conversations around this? And how much is this just giving a platform to someone who's very prominent to share these ideas to millions and millions of people? And also, should things like that be debated in the public eye? Because I feel like, especially when you're putting it on stage to millions and millions and millions of people, this quickly becomes a slippery slope. You know, I think things like just general like conservative versus liberal, these are kind of conversations that are interesting and like people can have conversations about, and like I clearly have my sides that I lie on, but like there's a level of conversation to actually be had. But when it's like, I think that LGBTQ identity is a social contagion that needs to be curbed, like what is there to debate about? And what is this doing more than just like platforming this idea is something normal and actually valuable of having conversation to? I think that's the big part of it. I don't think that like describing people as a social contagion that needs to be eradicated is a valuable conversation topic. And I think kind of positioning it in this debate gives it some sort of level of like, yes, this is an idea that should be engaged with, and there is potentially more than one side to it, and that we should have discourse about, and that like raises its legitimacy, if that makes sense. Like the way this stuff is framed makes me feel like if Jubilee existed like hundreds of years ago, I feel like they would be doing like one slave owner versus 25 slaves, or like one conservative lawmaker versus 25 women who want the right to vote. Like, you see how this is like a slippery scale that like gives legitimacy to certain ideas and certain ideologies that are reductive, that are means of social control, and are trying to push people out of public life, trying to push people away from having rights, so on and so forth. And I think Jubilee and all of these other platforms that are making content like this, if they actually thought about this and were thinking about like the ethics and kind of what this does socially, would come to that same sort of conclusion that platforming certain ideologies, if not co-signing them, at the very, very least gives them some level of legitimacy and presents it as something that needs to be talked about, as if, like I said, there is kind of a two sides to it sort of thing. Like personally, I'm not interested in debating fascist ideology. I know what fascism is, I know where that goes, I know what the end goal is. That is not a platform that is legitimate. That is not something that has a role in our society. That is not something we need to debate about and see if there's like some sort of middle ground we can come between. Like, no. So like, no, I don't think there is a middle ground. And I don't think that everything has a middle ground. I don't think that necessarily everything needs to be debated. I don't think that like debate is the medium for having a lot of these conversations a lot of times. And I think if we're being honest, a lot of this content is just to be messy, just to stir up drama, just to make money. And I think if the owner of Jubilee was being responsible, thinking about this from like an ethics and an actual empathetic and human understanding sort of perspective, he would admit that sometimes there isn't a middle ground. But I would love to hear what you all think about this content if you're someone who watches these videos. I can't endorse them. I can't say go watch them. Like I said, I watched this one and I suffered through it. There were a couple moments that did make me chuckle. Some of the people that like talked in the conversation were actually like pretty like interestingly like lighthearted about the conversation. And there were a few people that like seemed to have a good time with the debate. But largely it just like was giving me the ick in a lot of ways. But I'm curious what y'all think. So if you have thoughts, opinions, or feelings about Jubilee, debate content, who should and shouldn't be platformed, or just anything in general, definitely leave a comment below because I would love to hear your perspective. And I typically engage with all the comments, so I would love to have a conversation with you down there. But thank you so much for watching today's episode of Sunday Yap Session. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to give it a like because that helps me out quite a bit. And if you want to come yap with me every single Sunday, be sure to hit that subscribe button because I upload at least once a week, sometimes more. I will catch you in the next episode. See you later.